Calgary, Alberta is the hail capital of Canada. And on September 7th, back in 1991, they were shredded by a 30-minute hailstorm. Hi, I'm Chris May, writer, producer, and host of This Day in Weather History, now in its second year from the Weather Network in Canada. When it was surveyed afterward, it held the record for the most damaging hailstorm in Canadian history. This Day in Weather History. That record has actually been broken several times since then, with the hailstorm in 2020 currently holding the top spot. But what happened in 1991? On the afternoon of September 7th of 91, a severe hailstorm pounded the city of Calgary, Alberta for the 30 minutes I told you about at the beginning. The hailstones were 10 centimeters in diameter, and that is what we call tennis ball-sized hail. This happened over the Labor Day long weekend, and Labor Day came late that year, so when it happened, everybody was home and hoping for the final yaya before going back to school or work. This changed those plans rather abruptly. Instead of camping in Kananaskis, exploring Drumheller, hiking through Bamford Jasper, the people of Calgary were hoping and praying to avoid injury and severe damage to property. But this storm was too great and went on too long. For a full half hour, these large masses of mangled, congealed ice rocks hammered down on the city and not only damaged homes and cars, there were destroyed crops and trees that were split open, and hailstones even killed birds while they were still in flight. Welcome to year 2 of this podcast. Right now, you're listening to the full version of today's story on your favorite podcast provider, but there's also the daily podcast video short. They're shot right here in my podcast recording studio, so you get that perspective, and oftentimes they will include visuals from that day's event from when it happened in weather history. So after listening to the full story, go check out the podcast video short on television or online anytime at theweathernetwork.com/weather history. And just to dovetail from that if I can, I'd like to remind you where you can catch this podcast if you might be picking this up off our site or from within a story. You can look up or ask for This Day in Weather History, wherever you normally listen to your favorite podcasts, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Alexa, and now every day on yahoo.ca. Now, I have explained the science behind hailstorms before on this podcast, but here's a brief refresher. Hailstones are formed when raindrops, through updraft turbulence, are prevented from falling to the surface and are instead carried back upward into the extremely cold areas of the atmosphere and frozen into ice. They climb to these massive sizes when they collide with all the other still liquid water drops, and they freeze onto the hailstone surface. The longer this volley, it's kind of like a volleyball game, the longer this volley continues depends on the density and the height of the supercell. And that depends on a number of factors that also includes turbulent updrafts occurring. Hail then falls when it becomes heavy enough to overcome the strength of the thunderstorm updraft and is therefore pulled to the earth by gravity. At the time, it was the most expensive hailstorm in Canadian history as homeowners filed over 100,000 claims, totaling $342 million. It was also listed as the most expensive natural disaster in Canada when it happened in 1991. But of course, as history would play out, 7 years later, in 1998, the devastating ice storm would assume that mantle. But this storm most assuredly is still remembered today by those who suffered it back on September 7th, 1991. Hey, do you like the podcast? We'd love to hear from you. If you have an idea, go right now to wherever you're listening to me and rate us if you would, please. It's on a 5-star system, and we would love as many stars as you can afford. So rate us, but then also review us. This way we can always stay on top of how you'd like to see the show evolve. Then remember to subscribe to this podcast. Click the subscribe or follow button right there on the very same podcast homepage you're listening on. You'll be immediately reminded that the next day is ready to listen to, and you also have access to every episode in the archives. It dates back to June 1st of 2020, so there is a lot that we got to get caught up on this day in weather history. Tomorrow is September 8th, and for this day, I present to you a story that is very dear to me and all television weather presenters. It's also very special to meteorologists, weather fans, and especially all those that are in Canada. Because on September 8th of 1952, Canadian English television made its debut on CBC, And the first person to appear on the screen was a weather person. Percy Saltzman was a veteran meteorologist, and he had a weather story to tell for the first time on September 8th, back in 1952. On this day in weather history, with me, your host, Chris May.